Sometimes when life gets quiet, when friends drift away, opportunities dry up, and doors that once swung wide now slam shut, it feels like you've been forgotten, left alone, isolated. But what if I told you that isolation isn't punishment? What if I told you it's preparation? You see, God has a way of pulling us away from the noise, away from distractions, and even away from people, not to hurt us, but to work on us. Because there are some lessons you can only learn in solitude. Growth doesn't always happen in the spotlight. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen in the dark, behind closed doors, where no one else sees but you and God. When you're isolated, it's easy to question everything. Why me? Why now? But think about it. Before every major move in history, there was isolation. Moses spent years in the wilderness before leading his people to freedom. David was alone in the fields before he ever held a crown. Even Jesus spent 40 days in the desert before he stepped into his purpose. Isolation wasn't a setback for them, it was a setup. In isolation, God strips away what you don't need. Old habits, toxic relationships, doubt, and builds what you do need. Faith, strength, clarity. It's in the quiet that you start to hear his voice clearer. It's in the stillness that your purpose begins to sharpen. The blessing you're waiting for, it requires a version of you that can handle it, sustain it, and grow with it. And sometimes the only way to become that version is through isolation. Isolation is preparation, not punishment. This concept is difficult to grasp, especially when you're in the middle of it, when life feels quiet, empty, and disconnected. It's in those moments when nothing seems to be happening, when prayers feel unanswered, and when people you trusted suddenly fall silent, that you begin to wonder if you've been abandoned. But what if the silence isn't a sign that something is wrong, but rather that something important is happening? What if isolation is the soil where purpose begins to take root? Often we associate being alone with being forgotten. We measure progress by activity, noise, attention. If people are calling, if doors are opening, if the spotlight is on us, then surely things are going well. But what happens when the phone stops ringing? When opportunities dry up, when the room gets quiet and all you're left with is yourself, your thoughts, and a whole lot of waiting? That's when doubt creeps in. That's when fear knocks. And that's when we start to believe the lie that God has stepped back. But in reality, God is often most active in our lives when things appear still on the surface. There's a process to preparation. Think of a seed planted in the ground. Once it's buried beneath the soil, it disappears from view. No one sees it, no one checks on it, it's hidden. But beneath the surface, something powerful is happening. The seed is breaking open, transforming, stretching. It's doing the hard, unseen work of becoming. In time, it will break through the soil, but that can't happen until it's been. Isolation is the soil where God plants us, not to bury us in defeat, but to prepare us for breakthrough. When you're isolated, distractions fade, the noise dies down. You're left with a rare clarity that doesn't exist in crowded rooms and busy schedules. God doesn't always speak in thunder. Sometimes he whispers, and isolation allows you to finally hear him. It's not that he wasn't speaking before, it's that you were too distracted to listen. Isolation strips away the voices of others so you can tune into the voice that matters most. It's in that stillness that you begin to understand direction, purpose, identity. You begin to see yourself not through the eyes of people, but through the eyes of God. That's preparation. People tend to fear isolation because it feels like a step backward. But preparation doesn't always look like progress. You might not be moving forward in ways the world recognizes. No promotions, no applause, no public affirmation. But inside, you're being shaped into someone who can handle the weight of the blessing God has in store for you. The version of you that entered isolation won't be the same version that exits. And that's the point. Transformation rarely happens in public view. The greatest changes occur in hidden places where God has full access to shape you without the pressure of an audience. Think about a house being built. Before the walls go up and the paint goes on, there's groundwork. Foundations are laid, often for weeks or months, and from the outside it looks like nothing is happening. But without that foundation, the house can't stand. Isolation is that foundational work in your life. It's the season where God digs deep, levels the ground, and ensures what He's building in you won't crumble when the blessing comes. Because a blessing given too early can become a burden. God uses isolation to make sure you're ready, not just for the blessing, but for the responsibility that comes with it. It's easy to celebrate when the blessing arrives, but few people talk about the preparation it took to get there. Isolation is often lonely, but it's not purposeless. Every quiet day, every unanswered call, every missed opportunity is part of a bigger plan. God is not ignoring you. He's investing in you. He's working behind the scenes, orchestrating events, pruning what doesn't belong and strengthening what does. In isolation, you're being equipped with wisdom, patience, resilience, qualities that can't be rushed and can't be learned in the spotlight. The problem is, we want the promise without the process. We want elevation without preparation. But God knows better. He knows that if He gave you everything you prayed for right now, it might crush you. So instead, He prepares you in isolation, where you can be honest, broken, teachable, where your heart can be refined and your character strengthened. It's in those quiet places that God works on the deep stuff, the insecurities, the doubts, the fears that would otherwise sabotage the blessing. Preparation is an act of love. Isolation is God saying, I care too much about you to rush this. Even when it doesn't make sense, trust that God is strategic. Nothing in your life is wasted, especially not the seasons of isolation. They are intentional, tailored for your growth, and essential for your future. You may not understand why you've been pulled back, but know this: slingshots are pulled back before they're launched forward. Isolation may feel like a setback, but it's setting you up for a launch you couldn't achieve any other way. There is a blessing on the other side of this, but only if you allow the process to do its work. Preparation is rarely comfortable. It challenges you, stretches you, tests your patience, but it also refines you, molds you, and strengthens you. God doesn't isolate you to break you. He isolates you to build you. The greatest leaders, warriors, and visionaries all walked through seasons where it was just them and God. No fanfare, no recognition, just raw, unfiltered growth. If you find yourself in that place now, don't despise it, embrace it, because the preparation you're enduring in isolation is creating the foundation for the blessing you've been waiting for. Growth often happens in silence and solitude. This truth isn't glamorous, and it's not what most people want to hear. We live in a world that celebrates visibility, applause, and rapid results. People post their achievements, share their highlights, and measure their worth by likes, comments, and recognition. But real growth the kind that transforms you from the inside out. Usually doesn't happen under the spotlight. It happens in the quiet, when no one is watching, when no one is clapping, and when it feels like nothing significant is happening at all. In silence, there's space to reflect. When everything around you slows down and the distractions fade, you're left with your thoughts, your heart, your fears, and your dreams. That space is uncomfortable, which is why so many people run from it. They fill their time with noise, with people, with activity, anything to avoid the silence. But in doing so, they also avoid growth. Silence is where you start to hear what's really going on inside. The doubts you've buried, the pain you've ignored, the dreams you've suppressed, they all rise to the surface when the world goes quiet. And facing those things is the first step toward healing, clarity, and growth. Solitude is not about being lonely. It's about being intentional with your space and your time. It's choosing to step back from the crowd so you can tune in to what truly matters. In solitude, you stop comparing yourself to others because there's no one else in the room. You stop striving for approval because there's no audience to perform for. It's just you. And that's where you start to discover who you really are, not who you pretend to be, not who others expect you to be, but who you've been created to be. That discovery is the foundation of true growth. Growth in solitude teaches patience. Nothing worthwhile grows overnight. A tree doesn't reach its full height in a day, a week, or even a year. It takes time, seasons, and storms. The same goes for you. In solitude, you begin to understand that growth isn't a moment, it's a process. It's a series of small, consistent steps taken when no one's watching. It's waking up and choosing discipline over comfort, truth over convenience, and purpose over popularity. Those choices, repeated daily in solitude, are what builds strength, character, and resilience. In silence, you can hear your purpose calling more clearly. The noise of the world often drowns out the inner voice that tries to guide you. There are so many opinions, so many expectations, that it's easy to lose sight of your own path. But when you embrace silence, you create space for that inner voice to speak. You start to recognize what matters to you, what stirs your soul, what makes your heart come alive. That awareness doesn't come from being busy, it comes from being still. And in that stillness, you begin to align with your purpose in a way that activity alone can't accomplish. Growth also requires facing your weaknesses. In solitude, you can't hide behind other people or distract yourself with busyness. Your flaws, your fears, your limitations, they all become visible. But instead of running from them, solitude gives you the chance to confront them honestly. That confrontation is painful, but it's also powerful. You can't change what you won't face. And in the quiet, you're finally able to face the things that have been holding you back. Growth doesn't happen by avoiding discomfort. It happens by stepping into it and allowing it to shape you. There's also a strength that comes from walking through silence and solitude. When you learn to stand alone, you become unshakable. Your confidence no longer depends on the approval of others. Your peace is not dictated by circumstances. You find a grounding that doesn't shift with the tides of life. That kind of strength is rare, and it's forged in solitude. It's built through nights of wrestling with doubt, mornings of choosing faith over fear, and days of persevering without recognition. That quiet strength becomes your anchor when life gets chaotic, and it allows you to lead, serve, and live with authenticity. Solitude fosters creativity. When your mind isn't constantly reacting to the outside world, it has space to imagine, to create, to dream. Some of the greatest ideas, inventions, and breakthroughs have come from people who embrace solitude. In the stillness, your thoughts are free to wander, to explore new possibilities, to connect dots that others haven't seen. Creativity thrives when it's not pressured by deadlines or judged by instant feedback. It grows in the quiet, where ideas can take root and develop without fear of failure or rejection. Solitude isn't just a place of reflection, it's a place of creation. In silence, your spiritual life deepens. You begin to rely not on external validation, but on an internal connection with something greater than yourself. You pray more honestly, listen more attentively, and move more intentionally. Your faith isn't something you perform, it becomes something you live. In solitude, you experience the presence of God not as a distant concept, but as a real and sustaining force. That connection brings peace in uncertainty, hope in difficulty, and guidance in confusion. It's in the quiet that your roots grow deeper, enabling you to stand strong no matter what storms come. Growth in silence and solitude is not glamorous, but it's essential. It's where the foundation is laid for everything that comes next. The world may not see the effort, the tears, the discipline, or the sacrifices, but all of it matters. Every moment spent in solitude, every second embraced in silence is a brick in the structure of who you're becoming. While others chase quick wins and instant gratification, you're building something that lasts. Growth born in solitude is authentic, unshakable, and deeply rooted. It's not for show. It's for real life, for real impact, for a real purpose. God removes distractions to build clarity and strength. Life is filled with noise, constant notifications, endless conversations, and 1,000 things competing for attention. In the middle of that chaos, it becomes hard to hear, hard to think, and even harder to discern what truly matters. Distractions are not always bad things. Sometimes they come disguised as good opportunities, relationships, or even goals. But when those things pull you away from your purpose, your peace, and your connection to God, they become obstacles rather than blessings. That's why God, in His wisdom, steps in to strip away the distractions, not to deprive, but to refine, not to take away, but to give back something far more valuable: clarity and strength. Clarity is essential for direction. You can't pursue a goal you don't understand or walk a path you can't see. Distractions cloud vision. They fill your mind with noise, your calendar with chaos, and your heart with confusion. You start to chase what looks good instead of what's actually meant for you. You start to say yes to everything, thinking you're making progress, when in reality, you're drifting further from where you're supposed to be. That's where God intervenes. He begins to remove the clutter, not just around you, but inside you. He allows certain doors to close. He lets certain people walk away. He redirects your steps, even when it feels inconvenient or painful. Through that process, your focus sharpens. You begin to see what matters, what doesn't, and what you've been called to pursue. Strength isn't just about physical power or visible success. It's about inner resilience, the ability to stay grounded when everything around you shifts. Distractions drain strength. They divide your energy, scatter your attention, and leave you exhausted but unfulfilled. God knows that to carry the weight of your purpose, you need strength that runs deep. So He removes what weakens you the constant need for approval, the fear of missing out, the toxic relationships, the unnecessary commitments. It's not easy to let go of these things, especially when you become attached to them, but in the letting go, you make room for strength to grow. There's a discipline that develops when distractions are removed. You stop reacting to life and start responding with intention. Your time becomes valuable. Your thoughts become more focused. You begin to set boundaries, not out of selfishness, but out of a desire to protect your peace and stay aligned with your calling. That discipline becomes the framework for growth. It teaches you to prioritize, to say no when needed, and to stay committed even when the path isn't easy. Strength is built in those moments. When you choose consistency over comfort, purpose over popularity, and truth over trends. God doesn't just remove external distractions. He deals with the internal ones too. The thoughts that race in your mind, the insecurities that hold you back, the doubts that whisper you're not enough. Those are distractions too. They keep you from stepping fully into who you're meant to be. So God allows seasons where you have to confront them head on. He leads you into places of stillness where there's no escape, no hiding. In those places, you wrestle with your fears, question your assumptions, and discover the lies you've been believing. It's a painful process, but it's necessary for clarity and strength to emerge. Clarity brings peace. When you know who you are, what you're called to do, and where you're headed, anxiety begins to lose its grip. You no longer live in reaction to the world around you. You move with purpose, with confidence, with focus. That clarity doesn't come by accident. It's the result of God's intentional pruning, His willingness to remove what doesn't serve you so that you can become who you were meant to be. Just like a gardener cuts back branches to help a tree grow stronger and bear more fruit, God cuts away distractions to make room for your growth and fruitfulness. Strength is forged in resistance. When distractions are stripped away, you face the full weight of responsibility. There's no one else to blame, no excuses to hide behind. That pressure creates strength. You learn to depend on God, to trust His timing, to lean into His power. It's in the absence of distractions that your faith deepens. You stop looking to the world for answers and start seeking God for direction. That spiritual strength becomes your anchor, your foundation. It enables you to stand when others fall, to persevere when others quit, and to remain faithful even when results are slow. God's process of removing distractions is often misunderstood. It feels like loss, like things are falling apart, but in reality, things are falling into place. What feels like rejection is often redirection. What feels like an ending is actually a beginning. God sees the bigger picture. He knows what's ahead, what you'll need, and what could hinder you if left unchecked, so He steps in, not out of anger or punishment, but out of love. He wants you to succeed, not just in the world's eyes, but in His purpose for you. That success requires clarity of vision and strength of character. When distractions are removed, you start to hear God's voice more clearly. The noise of the world fades and His guidance becomes evident. He speaks through Scripture, through quiet moments, through the prompting of His Spirit. That clarity of communication becomes your compass. You begin to discern what opportunities are truly from Him and which ones are simply distractions in disguise. You start to walk in alignment, no longer swayed by every offer, opinion, or obstacle. That alignment brings progress, not just in achievement, but in becoming the person God designed you to be. The removal of distractions is not a one-time event, it's an ongoing process. As you grow, new distractions will arise. New challenges will come, but each time God will guide you through. He will continue to prune, to refine, to build. Clarity and strength are not destinations. They are qualities that develop over time through consistent surrender, obedience, and trust. Every season of distraction removed is an invitation to deeper focus, greater strength, and a closer walk with God. It's in that journey that you find purpose, peace, and the power to fulfill your calling. Biblical leaders experienced isolation before elevation. This pattern is consistent throughout Scripture, revealing a truth that is both challenging and comforting. Before God entrusted His chosen with great responsibility, influence, or authority, He first led them into seasons of isolation. These weren't moments of punishment or abandonment, but divine preparation. Isolation was the crucible where their faith was tested, their character refined, and their purpose clarified. In solitude, they learned dependence on God, cultivated inner strength, and became equipped for the destiny ahead of them. This recurring theme underscores a spiritual principle. Elevation requires preparation, and preparation often happens in the hidden places. Take Moses, for example. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by privilege. Yet his journey to becoming the leader of Israel didn't start there. After acting out of impulse and killing an Egyptian, he fled to the wilderness, a place of isolation and obscurity. For 40 years, Moses tended sheep in the desert, far from the spotlight of Egypt. In that solitude, God stripped away his pride, his reliance on status, and his past failures. It was in that barren place that Moses encountered God at the burning bush, received his calling, and was equipped with the humility and dependence necessary to lead a nation. Without that season of isolation, Moses would not have been ready to confront Pharaoh or guide the Israelites through the wilderness. Then there's Joseph. Favored by his father, he had dreams of greatness at a young age, but his path to elevation was anything but straightforward. Betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and later imprisoned, Joseph endured years of isolation from his family and freedom. Yet in those dark places, God was working. In Potiphar's house and in prison, Joseph developed leadership skills, learned to manage resources, and gained the wisdom to interpret dreams. His character was tested, his patience stretched, and his faith refined. When the time came, Joseph was elevated to second in command in Egypt. That sudden elevation was years in the making, forged in hidden, lonely places where only God could see his growth. David's story mirrors this same principle. Anointed as king while still a young shepherd boy, David didn't ascend to the throne immediately. Instead, he returned to tending sheep, living in obscurity while waiting for God's timing. Even after slaying Goliath and gaining recognition, David faced years of running from King Saul, hiding in caves, and living as a fugitive. Those years of isolation were not wasted. In the wilderness, David developed his trust in God, wrote psalms of worship and lament, and matured into a leader after God's own heart. By the time he was crowned king, David had been shaped by solitude, prepared to lead not just with might, but with a heart attuned to God's will. Jesus himself walked this path. Before launching his public ministry, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he fasted for 40 days and was tempted by the enemy. That period of isolation was not accidental, it was intentional. In the silence and solitude of the desert, Jesus demonstrated complete dependence on the Father, resisted temptation, and emerged empowered by the Spirit. His time alone was not a detour. It was the foundation for everything that followed. Throughout his ministry, Jesus often withdrew to solitary places to pray, to connect with the Father, and to be refreshed. Isolation wasn't just preparation for elevation. It was a consistent rhythm that sustained him. Paul, too, experienced isolation. After his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, he didn't immediately begin preaching to the masses. Instead, Paul spent time in Arabia, away from the apostles, in a period of preparation and revelation. In that solitude, he received understanding of the gospel, developed his theology, and built a foundation that would support his future ministry. When Paul finally emerged, he was equipped to write much of the New Testament and spread the gospel across nations. His influence was massive, but it was shaped in hidden places. The pattern is clear. Elevation in God's kingdom doesn't come from striving or self-promotion. It comes from surrender, from being willing to walk through seasons of isolation and trust that God is working in the silence. Those quiet places, away from the eyes of others, are where the deepest growth happens. It's where pride is broken, where identity is rooted not in what you do, but in who you belong to, and where faith is no longer theory, but a lived experience. Isolation allows for intimacy with God. In the absence of people's praise or criticism, you learn to hear God's voice with clarity. You stop performing and start listening. You stop relying on your own strength and start depending on His. That intimacy fuels confidence, not in yourself, but in the God who called you. When elevation comes, it doesn't shake you because you've already been anchored in the solitude of God's presence. The waiting in isolation also teaches patience. It breaks the addiction to instant gratification and cultivates endurance. You begin to understand that delay is not denial and that God's timing is perfect. In that waiting, you learn to steward the present moment, to be faithful with what's in your hands, even when it doesn't look like much. That faithfulness in the small, unnoticed things becomes the training ground for greater responsibility. Elevation without preparation can be dangerous. Without the grounding that comes from isolation, success can lead to arrogance, compromise, or collapse. God's love ensures that He prepares His people thoroughly before He elevates them. He is not interested in fleeting success, but in lasting impact. That's why He allows the hidden seasons, the lonely places, the years of silence. They are not wasted. They are intentional investments in your growth. Understanding that biblical leaders experienced isolation before elevation shifts your perspective on your own life. When you feel alone, when doors close, when people walk away, it's easy to feel forgotten. But remembering this truth reveals that isolation may be the very sign that God is preparing you for something greater. It's a season, not a sentence. It's a process, not a punishment. It's God's way of building you from the inside out so that when the time comes, you're not just elevated, you're ready. Isolation strips away false identities and reveals your true self. In the busyness of life, people often take on roles, personas, and masks that help them navigate the world. They become what others expect of them, adapting to the demands of relationships, work, culture, and society. Over time, it becomes easy to confuse these external roles with internal identity. Who you are gets entangled with what you do, who approves of you and how you perceive. This creates a fragile sense of self, one that is constantly shifting depending on circumstances and people's opinions. But when God leads you into isolation, those external influences are removed, and what's left is you, without the masks, without the performances, without the distractions. In isolation, there's no one to impress. The applause fades. The expectations fall silent. The comparisons stop. What remains is the raw, unfiltered version of you, the part that's often hidden even from yourself. That's where the real work begins. Isolation exposes what's beneath the surface. It reveals your fears, your insecurities, your wounds, your hopes, your strengths, and your weaknesses. It's uncomfortable, sometimes even painful, because it forces you to confront parts of yourself that have been buried or ignored. But that confrontation is necessary for growth. You can't heal what you won't face, and you can't become who you're meant to be if you're clinging to who you've been pretending to be. False identities are often formed through pain and survival. People adopt roles to protect themselves, to feel accepted, valued, or safe. Maybe someone learned to be a people pleaser because they feared rejection. Maybe someone chased success because they believed they had to prove their worth. Maybe someone stayed quiet to avoid conflict or became loud to cover up insecurity. These adaptations may help for a while, but they are unsustainable. They lead to burnout, confusion, and a disconnection from your true self. God doesn't want you to live from a place of performance. He wants you to live from a place of authenticity. And to do that, He leads you into isolation so those false identities can be dismantled. In that solitude, God begins to speak truth over you. Not the lies you've believed, not the labels others have given you, but the truth of who you are in Him. You are not your job, your achievements, your failures, or your relationships. You are not defined by what happened to you or what you've done. Your true identity is found in being a child of God, loved unconditionally, created with purpose, and designed with intention. In isolation, that truth starts to take root, not just in your mind, but in your heart. It becomes the foundation of your identity, unshakable and real. The process of stripping away false identities also reveals what truly matters to you. Without the noise of outside voices, you begin to rediscover your values, your passions, and your convictions. What once felt important may lose its grip, and what was neglected may rise to the surface. Isolation gives you the space to evaluate your life, your choices, and your direction. It's a time of realignment where you can shed what no longer serves you and embrace what brings you life, meaning, and purpose. That clarity doesn't come from chasing after more. It comes from sitting in the stillness and listening to your soul. Identity rooted in truth is powerful. When you know who you are, you no longer need to seek validation from others. You stop trying to fit in where you don't belong. You stop compromising your values for acceptance. You become secure, grounded, and confident, not because of external success, but because of internal alignment. That kind of identity cannot be shaken by circumstances, criticism, or failure. It allows you to show up fully, love deeply, lead authentically, and live with intention. But to get there, you have to walk through the refining fire of isolation, where everything false is burned away and only what's true remains. God uses isolation as a mirror. In the absence of distractions, you see yourself more clearly, not through the distorted lens of comparison or insecurity, but through the eyes of truth. You begin to see both your beauty and your brokenness, your potential and your need for grace. That self-awareness is not meant to shame you, but to free you. It frees you from pretending, from striving, from the exhausting cycle of proving your worth. It invites you into a deeper relationship with God, where your identity is not earned but received, not conditional but constant. In isolation, you also learn to love yourself as God loves you. Not the curated version of yourself, but the real you, the one with flaws, scars, dreams, and purpose. That kind of self-love is not rooted in ego, but in acceptance. It's knowing that you are enough, not because you've done enough, but because God says you are enough. That kind of love allows you to extend grace to yourself, to take risks, to pursue growth, and to live authentically. It empowers you to stop hiding and start living. False identities often keep people stuck. They trap you in cycles of fear, people-pleasing, and self-doubt. Isolation is God's way of breaking those cycles. It's not a punishment, it's a pathway to freedom. In the quiet, you find your voice. In the stillness, you find your courage. In the solitude, you find your truth. And in that truth, you find the strength to step into your calling, not as someone you think you should be, but as who you truly are. The stripping away is necessary for the building up. When God removes false identities, He doesn't leave you empty. He fills you with truth, purpose, and clarity. He reconstructs your identity on a foundation that will last. The isolation becomes a place of transformation, where the old falls away and the new emerges. It's in that sacred space that you begin to walk, not in fear, but in freedom. Not in confusion, but in clarity. Not in pretense, but in power. You realize that your worth was never in the roles you played, the titles you held, or the approval you chased. Your worth was always in who you are, a creation of God, chosen, loved, and called. That realization is not just liberating, it's life-changing. It allows you to show up in the world with authenticity, confidence, and peace. And it all begins in isolation, where God removes the noise, reveals the truth, and reintroduces you to who you really are. In isolation, God cultivates spiritual depth and resilience. These qualities are not developed in comfort or ease. They are forged in the hidden places where faith is stretched, refined, and strengthened. Spiritual depth is the ability to connect with God beyond surface-level experiences, to understand His heart, to discern His voice, and to walk with Him intimately. Resilience is the inner fortitude that enables a person to endure trials, overcome adversity, and remain steadfast in the face of challenges. Both are essential for those whom God is preparing for greater responsibilities, and both are birthed in the crucible of isolation. When distractions are stripped away and the noise of life fades, a space is created where the soul can truly encounter God. It is in that stillness that the superficial gives way to the substantial. You begin to hunger not just for blessings, but for the presence of the one who blesses. Prayer shifts from a routine to a lifeline. The Word of God becomes more than a text. It becomes nourishment, direction, and revelation. In isolation, you begin to seek God, not for what He can do, but for who He is. That shift deepens your relationship with Him, anchoring your faith in His character, not just His acts. Spiritual depth involves a greater awareness of God's presence in all things. It's the ability to find Him in silence, to trust Him in uncertainty, and to remain close to Him when feelings fade. In the quiet of isolation, God becomes more than a concept. He becomes real, tangible, and near. It's in those hidden moments that you begin to understand His nature, His faithfulness, His goodness, His sovereignty. You start to see His hand not just in the miraculous, but in the mundane. This awareness brings peace, even when circumstances don't change, because your soul is anchored in a truth deeper than what's visible. Isolation also challenges your faith. Without the encouragement of others or the structure of community, you must decide whether you truly believe what you claim. Do you trust God when the answers don't come quickly? Do you believe His promises when you can't see evidence? These questions surface in solitude, and the answers shape the foundation of your faith. Doubts may arise, and that's not a failure. It's part of the process. Wrestling with questions in isolation can lead to a more authentic and personal faith, one that's not inherited or borrowed, but owned. That ownership makes your faith resilient. Resilience is built through trials. In isolation, you may face disappointment, fear, loneliness, or rejection. These experiences are not wasted. They are opportunities to develop endurance, patience, and strength. Resilience is not about being unaffected by pain. It's about growing through it. It's about getting back up when life knocks you down, about trusting God when nothing makes sense, and about staying faithful even when it's hard. In isolation, you learn to rely on God as your source of strength. When the usual support systems are gone, you discover that He is enough, that His grace truly is sufficient. The process of cultivating spiritual depth and resilience is slow and often uncomfortable. There's a stripping away of what is shallow or weak, and a building up of what is strong and lasting. God refines you like gold in fire, not to destroy, but to purify. The fire reveals what's true, burns away what's not, and leaves behind something more valuable. This refining doesn't happen in the spotlight. It happens in secret. And though it's hidden from others, it's seen by God. He values the heart that seeks Him in the hidden place, the faith that holds on in the darkness, the soul that worships without a crowd. Isolation is where you develop spiritual disciplines that sustain you. It's where you learn to pray not out of obligation, but out of necessity. Where you meditate on Scripture not to check a box, but to hear from God. Where you fast not to earn favor, but to draw nearer. These disciplines become lifelines, anchoring you in God's presence and empowering you to face whatever comes. They're not just practices. They are tools for resilience, habits that nourish your soul and strengthen your spirit. In isolation, they become part of you, shaping who you are and how you live. Spiritual depth also brings discernment. In the stillness, you learn to distinguish God's voice from all others. You become sensitive to His leading, able to sense His direction, and confident in His guidance. This discernment is crucial when you step into greater responsibility. Without it, you risk being swayed by opinions, circumstances, or emotions. With it, you can walk in wisdom, clarity, and purpose. Discernment allows you to lead, serve, and love from a place of alignment with God's will, not your own agenda. It protects you from distractions and equips you to make decisions rooted in truth. Resilience equips you for the long journey. Life will bring challenges, setbacks, and disappointments. Without resilience, these can break you. With it, they can make you stronger. Resilience is the ability to keep going, to persevere, to maintain hope. It's born in the moments when you want to give up but choose to trust God instead. In isolation, you practice this choice again and again, and each time you do, your spirit is strengthened. You realize that storms don't define you, failures don't destroy you, and pain doesn't have the final word. You become unshakable, not because life is easy, but because your foundation is secure. God uses isolation to form people who are not just gifted but grounded, not just talented but tested, not just called but committed. Spiritual depth and resilience are the qualities that sustain you when elevation comes. They keep you humble in success, faithful in struggle, and steady in transition. They ensure that your influence is not hollow, but filled with substance and integrity. They allow you to carry the weight of blessing without crumbling under it, to serve others from a place of fullness, and to represent God with authenticity. The hidden work of isolation is often overlooked, but it's the most important work of all. It's the foundation upon which everything else is built. Without it, elevation is unsustainable. With it, you are prepared for whatever God has in store. The solitude, the silence, the stripping away, it all has a purpose. It's in those moments that God goes deep, digging into the soul, planting seeds that will bear fruit in time. The fruit of spiritual depth is peace, wisdom, love, and faithfulness. The fruit of resilience is strength, endurance, courage, and hope. These fruits are not instant. They grow slowly, cultivated in the soil of isolation. Isolation is never easy. It challenges us in ways we never expected, exposing our deepest fears, insecurities, and doubts. It pulls us away from the familiar and places us in a space of discomfort, where the noise of the world is replaced by the sound of our own thoughts. And yet, in that very space, in the silence and stillness, something sacred happens. God begins to work. He begins to shape, to mold, to refine, to prepare. What we often see as a season of abandonment is in truth a season of divine attention. It is not that God has left us, it's that He has drawn us closer into a space where He has our full attention and where we can finally hear His voice without distraction. Throughout Scripture, we see time and time again that God uses isolation to prepare His people for something greater. Moses spent years in the desert before leading Israel. David tended sheep alone before becoming king. Joseph was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and imprisoned before he stepped into the palace. Jesus Himself spent time in the wilderness before beginning His public ministry. These were not wasted years. They were not detours or delays. They were intentional seasons where God was doing deep work beneath the surface. Far from the eyes of the world, He was building character, developing faith, instilling purpose, and establishing identity. He was preparing them for the weight of the calling He had placed on their lives. It's easy to celebrate blessings, but what we often fail to realize is that blessings come with responsibility, with pressure, with challenges that require strength and depth. Without preparation, the very thing meant to elevate us can overwhelm us. God, in His wisdom and love, doesn't just open doors, He prepares us to walk through them. He doesn't just give opportunities, He ensures we are equipped to handle them. And the equipping doesn't always happen in public. It happens in private, in solitude, in those long, quiet nights when we feel forgotten, but are in fact being formed. In isolation, we come face to face with ourselves. All the masks fall away. All the false identities are stripped, and we are left with the truth of who we are. It is in that place of honesty that God begins to speak truth over us, reminding us that our worth is not in what we do, but in who we are. That we are loved not because we perform, but because we belong. That we are chosen not by man, but by Him. It is from this place of identity that purpose flows, that calling is confirmed, that direction becomes clear. Isolation is also the space where resilience is built. When there is no one to encourage us, we learn to encourage ourselves in the Lord. When there is no one to lean on, we learn to lean fully on Him. We learn to walk by faith, not by sight. to trust in promises, not in circumstances, to stand firm even when everything around us feels uncertain. This resilience becomes the bedrock of our faith, the inner strength that carries us through every storm, every trial, every challenge. It is not flashy, it is not loud, but it is unbreakable. There is a purpose in your isolation. God is not punishing you, He is preparing you. He is setting you apart, not to forsake you, but to anoint you. He is teaching you to depend on Him, to hear His voice, to follow His lead. He is equipping you with the wisdom, the character, and the spiritual depth you will need for what's ahead. And when the time is right, He will bring you out of the wilderness and into the promise. But when you step into that new season, you won't be the same. You'll be stronger, wiser, and ready. You'll carry not just a blessing, but the maturity to steward it well. So do not despise your season of isolation. Do not rush it. Do not fight it. Do not resent it. Embrace it as a divine invitation, a sacred space where God is doing His greatest work in you. Trust that the same God who led you into this season will lead you out. But He will not lead you out until the work is done. And when it is done, you will emerge with a testimony, with a fire that cannot be quenched, with a purpose that cannot be shaken. Let your isolation drive you closer to God. Let it deepen your faith, clarify your vision, and solidify your identity. Let it be the place where you learn to worship without an audience, to pray without ceasing, to stand without applause. Because when the blessing comes, when the doors open, when the light shines again, you will know that you are not standing on hollow ground. You are standing on a foundation that was built in the secret place, in the quiet moments, in the unseen hours. God uses isolation not to break you, but to make you, not to silence you, but to refine your voice, not to punish you, but to prepare you for the blessing that's coming. Every moment of solitude, every tear, every unanswered question, it's all part of the process. And when you see the full picture, when the pieces come together, you'll understand that isolation was never a curse. It was a gift that shaped you, strengthened you, and set you apart. You are not alone. You are being prepared. You are not forgotten. You are being formed. You are not abandoned. You are being called. And in due time, you will rise, not as who you were, but as who God has always intended you to be. So embrace the isolation, walk through it with faith, and know that on the other side, there is a blessing waiting that your heart cannot yet imagine. The wilderness is temporary, but the blessing is eternal. Let God do His work. Let Him finish what He started. And when you step into your next season, you will carry not only the blessing, but the strength, the wisdom, and the anointing to walk in it fully.